This is a Mugstain Productions podcast.
Hi guys! Welcome to episode 1 of Mythological Musings. Today we're talking about Daedalus and his son Icarus. So, I know, Icarus is kind of a weird place to start, but it's one of my favorite myths out there and I just had to start somewhere I'm comfortable. I actually have an Icarus tattoo on my back. It's him falling from the sky, wings melting, ass out, the important stuff. And yeah, it was an pretty tense second tattoo to get, but I couldn't resist. See, I've always found mythology interesting. I mean, what kid doesn't? But in an extremely neurodivergent kid fashion, my interest spiraled into me having to know absolutely everything about all myths I could learn about. And obviously, because I'm sitting here in my room alone, pillows lining the walls in an attempt to record in the crispiest way possible, that love hasn't diluted in any way. And pertaining to the crispiness, my dog is currently in the room with me, and he is a habitual feet licker, so if you hear that in the background, so many apologies. All of the apologies coming your way. So yeah, we're gonna start with Icarus because he's one of my favorites, and it felt wrong to start a mythology podcast in any other way. The story of Daedalus and Icarus was brought to us by the Roman poet Ovid in his collection Metamorphoses. Between the pair, it's Icarus' name that typically brings a light to people's eyes when you mention the story. Think about it. Even in the reference of Hamilton, it only mentions Icarus. You've married an Icarus. He has flown too close to the sun. I promise that is the only instance where I will sing in this script. But still, Icarus is the focal point of the story. Whenever anyone mentions it in casual passing, it's Icarus we bring up. So it's interesting that we're actually going to begin way before his birth, and most of the story is going to focus on Daedalus, not Icarus. Daedalus is, of course, Icarus' dad. Born in Athens, or maybe Cretan, because myths, was an unparalleled sculptor, and one of Plato's many dialogues. And we will get to Plato in a later episode. He's kind of a big deal in myths, though, so don't forget about him. But in one of his many dialogues, he mentions a legend that Daedalus' art was so incredibly lifelike that they would tie his sculptures down in fear that they would wake up one day and run away. Which honestly is the complimentiest compliment anyone could ever receive on their art. And beyond making hyper-realistic sculptures, Daedalus was an inventor. The ancients, which are basically texts so old that we don't really have a solid grasp on who created the myths, or sung them first, or wrote the first poem or whatever, attributed a lot of invention to him, most notably carpentry. Daedalus was so talented that they attributed the entirety of carpentry to his name. Despite that level of talent, he didn't go through life completely unparalleled in his work. He quickly became very noticed for his work, obviously with the entire creating carpentry thing, that his sister, Perdiccas, believed that her son, Talos, should go study with his uncle in Athens. Quick sidebar to mention that Talos is also known as Kalos, which is understandable, or Perdiccas, which we will get to that particular name because that's one of confusion, not mistranslation. But while we're here in the sidebar, I'll just explain this super fast. Myths were told through poems that were either sung, acted, or recited for groups of people for entertainment or religious purposes. Some of the greatest myths of all time were just created one day off the dome of some dude, and either he had to go home and write down what he remembered saying, or some probably drunk guy wrote down what he was saying as he was saying it. These stories were either retold by memory to other people and passed that way, or the varying written versions were passed around, translated, and became more varying as time passed. That's to say, just like any myth or fairy tale, there are always going to be different versions and details. I will always do my best to find the most accurate, the most widely reported version of these myths, and then tip my hat to other variations, but I am only one human, and I can mess up or just be familiar with a version that isn't exactly like the one you know. And that's okay, it's just important to note, especially as I'm posting this online for the world to hear. You're going to know different versions than I do. You're going to remember different details than I do. This is what's most widely reported, or the version that I know. But let's get back to Daedalus' nephew, who we'll call Talos because that is the most common version of his name. So Talos went to live with his uncle Daedalus in Athens and started learning everything he could teach him. And Talos learned fast. He was young and witty and the knowledgeable sponge that most children are, and he quickly started taking in the knowledge Daedalus shared and applied it to the world around him. And it didn't take long for Daedalus to recognize that his nephew was smart. Beyond smart. Actually, smarter than him. Daedalus quickly concluded that, should he be left to follow this path, his nephew would completely overshadow him. And so, like anyone would, Daedalus resorted to murder. He took Talos to the cliff of the Acropolis and promptly shoved him off. Which is not the move you should take if A, you're looking to win the world's best uncle award, or B, you live near the city of Athena, which was Athens, because she saved the boy by turning him into a bird. And she named the bird Paradix after his mother. Which, that was the point I was talking about between the name confusion rather than a mistranslation. Talos turns into the bird Paradix, which is named after his mother, so it becomes his name, while it's also his mother's name and the name of the bird he gets turned into. Confusing, but less so than Talos being known by his mother's name way before Daedalus tries the entire murder thing. And despite the fact that the boy lived, Daedalus was tried for attempted murder and was banished from Athens. He moved on to find refuge in the court of King Minos, the king of Crete. Before Daedalus joined King Minos' court, he was already strong in military power and strategy. With Daedalus, he became unstoppable. And truly, they were a powerful pair. In this partnership, King Minos was gifted the incredible power of having Daedalus on his side, and Daedalus was gifted the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to move on and start over. He, unfortunately, used this new start to purchase a slave by the name of Nakukrate. And I did do my best to find a pronunciation of her name, but I couldn't find one anywhere, so that's my best shot. It was with her that Daedalus had his son Icarus, which to me doesn't sound completely consensual, given that Daedalus owned her at the time. But we already know that Daedalus isn't a good guy, so really, who's all that surprised? Unfortunately, there isn't really a lot of information about Icarus' early life or his relationship with his father. Like I said at the beginning, a lot of this story doesn't talk about Icarus much at all. I mean, given Daedalus' past, though, we can probably make some guesses as to if he was a stellar dad, but I digress. Set for life, Daedalus did raise Icarus in Crete until King Minos' wife, Pasiphae. I have my list of phonetical spelling right next to me, and oh my goodness, that one is right at the top. Pasiphae asked for a favor, and oh boy, what a favor it was. Pasiphae wanted to mate with an animal, specifically a bull, which, okay, there is a reason for the bull, but I feel weird telling you to just hear me out for a second because it truly sounds yuccas, and it is yuccas, but slightly less than you might be thinking. Hear me out, let me just explain. So, a while before this request, King Minos asked Poseidon, god of the sea and such, you know that guy, to send him a sign of divine favor in the form of a beautiful bull. Odd choice, in my opinion, but that's what he wanted, and that's what Poseidon sent after King Minos promised to return the bull by way of sacrifice. So the god sent King Minos a uniquely beautiful bull, which emerged from the sea. I'm going to take a moment and stall on that. First, I am unsure as to why King Minos wanted this, and why he wanted a bull specifically. Beyond that, why was Poseidon the one he thought of for a bull? And it came from the ocean, as bulls do. Anyway, King Minos was happy that Poseidon favored him, but upon seeing the sea bull, he didn't really want to sacrifice it. Instead, he sacrificed a different, non-sea bull in his place. Which, if you know anything about myths, and I'm assuming you do, given that you're here with me today, that didn't go well, because Poseidon honored his side of the deal, but King Minos did not, and he was punished swiftly. The punishment? His wife, Pasiphae, was cursed with divine madness that filled her with the uncontrollable impulse to mate with Poseidon's bull. And because it was a bull, it wasn't exactly keen to comply with her mad urges. So naturally, to Daedalus she went. His solution was to carve a wooden cow on wheels, hollow it out, and then cover it in the hide of a skinned cow that he sewed tightly around it. Then they set that in the meadow that the bull grazed in. Pasiphae was then set inside the hollowed-out cow wooden sculpture thing while the bull was in the meadow, and the solution was successful. And thus the Minotaur was born, half man, half bull. You know the beast. King Minos was not very happy when he saw the creature, so he asked another favor of Daedalus. He wanted him to construct a labyrinth, the labyrinth that you're probably thinking of, actually, to hide the creature. Daedalus complied, and, just as any king would, King Minos used the Minotaur to reign over Athens by asking for 7 young women and 7 young men from the city to be fed to the beast. In another tale, Theseus will come to slay the Minotaur, which I might cover in a set of mini-tales in a later episode. Okay, another sidebar this time, but this one is not about mythology and is instead about Florida weather. it has suddenly started pouring, so if you hear that in the background, many apologies. Anyway, according to Ovid, it was after this that Daedalus grew to hate Crete, and he wanted to return to the newly freed from Minotaur terrorist Athens. But King Minos imprisoned him. It's a little unclear if this was to keep his master inventor nearby, or if King Minos discovered Daedalus' role in helping his wife create the Minotaur, but both Daedalus and his son were thrown into a cell, and that's where the most memorable part of our story starts. And I say memorable not because the rest of the myth hasn't been memorable thus far. I think it has. But it's because this part seems to be what the collective conscious of Western society at least is somewhat familiar with. Life in the prison wasn't easy, but the two men had each other. Icarus and Daedalus spent some time together in the cell. It's unclear how much. But Daedalus was determined to leave and return to Athens. But King Minos controlled the seas and ships that surrounded the island of their cell, and it was impossible to travel by road because he would have to enter the sea at some point. Ever the thinker, Daedalus was quoted by Ovid as saying, "He, Minos, may thwart our escape by land or sea, but the sky is surely open to us. We will go that way. Minos rules everything, but he does not rule the heavens." The answer as to how Daedalus and Icarus would tame the heavens and find their freedom would haunt the imaginations of people until we were able to take flight ourselves. I am, of course, talking about the wax wings. Daedalus studied the birds he saw flying outside of their window and drew up plans for a device that would mimic their flight. He used their discarded feathers, beeswax, candle wax, and thread to create what would form their escape. By laying the feathers down on the thread in orders of smallest to largest, and then affixing them together with the wax of candles and bees, Daedalus created 2 sets of wings to carry him and his son to freedom. Think stereotypical angel wings that you see in any sort of classical painting. As he finished Icarus's wings, he warned him, "Let me warn you, Icarus, to take the middle way, in case the moisture weighs down your wings if you fly too low, or if you fly too high, the sun scorches them. Travel between the extremes, and I order you not to aim towards Bootes, the herdsman, or Halsey, the great bear, or towards the drawn sword of Orion. Take the course I show you." Of course, this is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Daedalus, though he spoke dramatically, was warning his son that this escape was not a game or a fun trip, despite the thrill the wings might bring. The journey ahead was dangerous, and Daedalus was becoming increasingly aware that his son was not heeding him. Icarus played with the feathers and mocked his father's dramatic warnings. But there was no other escape option, and they had to take to the sky. Daedalus took to the sky first, teaching Icarus how to use his wings and leading the way to freedom simultaneously. Ovid writes that those below them thought the pair to be gods as they flew, but their mortality was never more in the spotlight than in that moment. Daedalus and Icarus left Crete this way and started approaching the island of Samos. It was here that Icarus became arrogant. He felt the freedom of the sky, the wind, and the sun calling to him. He wanted to fly to heaven, as far as he could go, and so he ignored his father's warnings and began to climb. Higher and higher he went, tasting the salt of the heavens on his tongue. Closer to freedom than ever, the wax holding Icarus's wings together began to melt. He ignored the dripping hot wax, along with his father's warnings, flying higher and higher and higher until all the wax was gone. He began falling, the heavens at his fingertips, and rapidly growing farther and farther away. He cried, "Father," as he fell. Daedalus, still in Ovid's words, replied, "Icarus! Icarus, where are you? Which way should I be looking to see you?" But it was too late, and Icarus had already fallen into the depths of the dark sea. The same sea would be renamed the Icaran Sea. It didn't take long for Daedalus to find the body of his son, along with the scattered feathers. He took his son's broken body to the nearest island and buried it there. And, because the range of the wide sea was not enough to contain the grief of the loss of a son, the island was also named after Icarus, to be called Icara. As Daedalus finished Icarus's grave, a little bird flew near his head. It was his nephew, Talos, who was of course now the bird Perdix, returned to watch the suffering of the man who had once tried to kill him. And yeah, that's the end of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus does go on to do a few more things, which we will probably touch on in another episode, but that's it for his story. It's largely understood that Icarus's death is in response to the attempted murder of Talos, and there is irony there. Talos, who Daedalus took under his wing, pun not intended, would have been smart enough to avoid the sun, but Daedalus tried to kill him. So when life progressed and Daedalus tried to move on and live beyond that, his only son would be killed by arrogance. So, full circle, what does my tattoo mean? Don't try to kill my nephew? Not exactly, even though my sister is expecting and I might have a nephew on the way. But honestly, I see my tattoo as a reminder to remain level-headed, to not fly too close to the sun in a fit of youthful arrogance. If Icarus had listened to his dad, he would have been able to experience the feeling of flying countless times after with his wings. In turn, people also get upside-down Icarus tattoos to remind themselves that, even when you feel like you're falling, there's still the opportunity to fly again if you remain calm. I kind of think of mine as a mix between those two. Also, I really like mythology, and the artwork was really cool, so there's that too. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our first episode together. I know it's a little bit of a shorter one. I hope to have you all back again for an episode 2. It should hopefully be a little bit longer. I just wanted to start with something simple, succinct, something I already knew that I didn't have to research too much, and I knew that I could tell well. Now is the time for a little bit of behind the screen things, a few call outs. I'm a part of the Mugstain Productions podcast network. You may know me as Kenya Thefine on Hacks Rolls. I know I sound a lot different, a lot less southern here. But there's a lot of fun things coming up in the podcast network. I think this might be the first independent podcast coming out under the network that is not a whole band of people, but we have a whole cacophony of things coming up in the future that you might want to look out for. As of right now, this podcast does not have a schedule or an Instagram account. So if you want to know when I'm going to be posting new episodes, updates on the podcast, follow Mugstain Pods, MUGSTAINPODS on Instagram. That's the network. There you'll find updates on all sorts of projects, including a little bit of a behind-the-screen peek, Hacks Rolls, which is our D&D podcast, Mythological Musings, which is obviously this podcast. We're looking at some spooky stuff that I can't say anything else about. I am currently working on producing a sleep story podcast for all of you fellow insomniacs around there. We have Talking Nerds, which is something that is still so heavily under construction that I can't say anything else about it other than the title, which I think I'm not even supposed to say. And then there's Unknown Radio, which is a Pokemon podcast that should actually be coming out soon. And then we have a sort of TV show watching podcast that we're also thinking and talking about. And I can't say anything else about because nothing else is solidified. As for the future of this podcast, like I said, there's no current schedule. I have kind of a hectic life as everybody else does, but Claudia is already spamming me with cool lesser known myths from not Greece for me to research, so maybe we'll do that next week. Or maybe I'll stay in my comfort zone of Greece and maybe I'll venture into Rome, who knows. All I know is that I hope you have a wonderful day, night, afternoon, or morning. Goodbye!